just a minute here. Thanks for joining us today. Hello, everyone. Welcome to All Four's webinar on data center air permitting in Virginia. My name is Sahil Barucha, and I'm a technical consultant at All Four, and I have a background in data center permitting. And today we have two of our air quality experts on the call who are going to be presenting the permitting process in Virginia and the latest changes on the regulatory process. As presenters, first we have Sharon Sadler, our data center sector lead, who has been an environmental consultant for 22 years and has supported data centers for more than half of her career. She leads the All for Washington, D.C. office in Herndon, Virginia, and for that reason, she's also very familiar with the data center space. Our second presenter is Harry Ohl. Harry is a project consultant with All Four. He is also in the Washington, D.C. office, and he's been with All Four for 3 years. And Harry's primary focus is air permitting in the data center industry. We are going to go through a few logistics and for this presentation, for this webinar, we're going to leave 15 minutes for Q&A at the end. So if you have any questions during the presentation, please type them in using the Q&A feature, and we'll get to those at the end of the main presentation. You are also going to receive a certificate of completion automatically after the presentation over. And lastly, there will be a recording on our website of this presentation, so you'll be able to see that and a copy of the slides as well. And with that, we'll go ahead and get started with Harry. Back to you, Harry.
All right, thank you, Sahil. So as an overview of our presentation today, what we're going to talk about, we'll start with some regulatory background for air permits, talk about some federal and state air permitting. We'll then talk about different emission source types that you typically see at data centers, some early permitting considerations early in the process. What can we be thinking about for air permitting? We'll talk about some challenges associated with air permitting. At that point, I'll turn it over to Sharon and she'll talk about some nuances of Virginia air permitting and then some timelines and post submittal actions associated with that. So, why are air permits required for data centers or any other facility in the first place? Well, the Clean Air Act as we know it was initially passed by Congress in 1970 and later amended in 1977 and 1990. The Clean Air Act and its amendments established the National Ambient Air Quality Standards, or NAAQS, for 6 criteria pollutants, those being ozone, nitrogen dioxide, particulate matter, sulfur dioxide, carbon monoxide, and lead to protect human health and the environment. Compliance with the NAAQS drives the creation of much of what we're going to talk about today. To attain compliance with the NAAQS, EPA and the states established regulations and processes to permit emission sources and identify and enforce emissions reductions as needed. Areas that have already attained compliance with the NAAQS can have different requirements than those that still need to bring down the concentration of pollution in their area to comply. The Clean Air Act also established the Prevention of Significant Deterioration, or PSD program, to carefully evaluate and potentially mitigate a project's impacts to air quality in areas that are meeting the NAAQS, also called being in attainment with the NAAQS. For areas that are not in attainment with the NAAQS or they're not currently meeting those standards, a separate permitting program was established called Non-Attainment New Source Review, or NNSR. Additionally, the Clean Air Act created the Federal Operating Permit Program known as Title V, which may be needed for some facilities after obtaining a construction permit. which we will touch on a bit in the later slides. The Clean Air Act also established the standards of performance for new stationary sources, or NSPS, and the National Emission Standards for Hazardous Air Pollutants, or NESHAP, which outline emission standards for a wide variety of sources across all sorts of industries, from manufacturing to the chemical sector to hospitals and even data centers. Data centers are concerned primarily with the NSPS subpart Quad I and NSPS subpart Quad J, which establish standards for new diesel and natural gas fired engines. If a facility has older units, then NESHAP subpart Quad Z might become applicable, but the majority of units that we see at data centers are considered new, and they comply with subpart Quad Z by complying with the appropriate NSPS regulation. Several data centers are also evaluating and beginning to install combustion turbines, and those must comply with the standards set in NSPS subpart Quad K or subpart Quad KA. So on the previous slide, we talked about the origins and regulatory background of air permitting, but now let's move into federal and state air permitting. EPA has delegated authority for most air permitting to the states. However, in some air permitting instances, primarily for large emitters, those still require federal involvement. Prior to building a new facility with emission sources, a construction air permit must be obtained in many cases. If the project exceeds certain emissions thresholds, the data center must go through the Federal New Source Review, or NSR, construction permitting process. If the area where the data center is located is classified as in attainment with the NACS, this would fall under the PSD permitting program, with a major source threshold for a data center of 250 tons per year of any criteria pollutant. The major source threshold for PSD's 28 identified source categories is lower, but data centers typically don't fall into any of those sources. Should your site have on-site power generation, including combined cycle natural gas turbines, the major source threshold then reduces from 250 tons per year to 100 tons per year of any criteria pollutant. Alternatively, if the area where your data center is located is classified as in non-attainment with the NACS, this would fall under the non-attainment new source review permitting program, with major source thresholds that vary based on the classification. For diesel generators, the primary pollutants of concern are typically NOx and CO. The attainment statuses vary from moderate to severe, from moderate to serious, then severe, and then extreme. Each of those have lower emissions thresholds as the severity increases. Northern Virginia, for example, is a moderate non-attainment area for ozone, while the remainder of the state is in attainment with the NACS. If the data center is considered a major source under either of these permitting programs, it can result in a lengthy permitting process, which would likely require some combination of extensive modeling, emissions offsets, public input, or emission control requirements. A data center may not be required to do everything I mentioned if it's a major source, but some combination of those items will be required. We should note that these permitting programs consider project potential emissions of criteria pollutants, which might include the entire facility or be a subset of sources to compare to these major source thresholds. The definition of a project is quite complicated and will not be covered in further detail here, but we do recommend reaching out to your environmental consultant to discuss further. And data centers often avoid major NSR and the associated longer permitting processes by taking federally enforceable limits on operating time or fuel consumption to intentionally reduce potential emissions below the major source thresholds and therefore be permitted as a synthetic minor source. Each state has its own US EPA commitments and targets to meet the NACS, which is usually achieved through its own air quality program. State air quality programs have their own air pollution control regulations and an air permitting program, which includes key permitting thresholds and exemptions for sources. When a new or expanded data center is planned, an evaluation is first needed to determine what construction permitting program will be pursued. If potential emissions exceed major source thresholds, the federal construction permitting programs I mentioned before will apply depending upon the attainment status of the area. If potential emissions are below major source thresholds, either due to a small quantity of equipment or through the acceptance of those federally enforceable limits, then only the state's NSR permitting program will apply. This should be reviewed early to understand the requirements for the proposed emission sources. Depending on the type of sources and their total potential emissions, some states only require a facility and its equipment to be registered, and they won't even issue a formal air permit. In other cases, the process may be extensive to get an air permit. The state permitting program outlines the required forms and other permit application components, and if air dispersion modeling will be required. Additionally, states might set more stringent short term emissions rate requirements than what is established in the federal engine rules. In several states, you'll hear this referred to as best available control technology or BACT requirements. Once air permits are issued, states will also have a compliance and enforcement branch to ensure that the conditions of that permit are followed. The federal construction permitting discussed on the previous slide is typically conducted at the state level, but it may involve US EPA input, especially in the case of Title V major facilities. So everything we've discussed up to this point falls under construction permitting, but an additional step may be required if a data center needs to apply for and secure an operating permit. This would occur after the construction permit has been issued and may require an additional evaluation to determine the source type of the facility. As discussed back in the beginning, the Clean Air Act created the Federal Operating Permit Program and the Major Source Program, often referred to as Title V. Under this program, the major source threshold is 100 tons per year of a criteria pollutant unless the facility is located in a non attainment area. The emissions compared to this major source threshold are aggregated emissions from the entire facility or campus that is under common ownership rather than project emissions, which may or may not encompass the same emission sources. As mentioned, this is a federal program, but the permits are typically issued at the state level. Many states require facilities to obtain operating permits even if they are a minor source or a synthetic minor source. And Virginia does have a state operating permit, but it's rarely used for data centers. So, what are the emission sources of interest at a data center that would require air permits? Air permitting for data centers is primarily focused on the engines that drive emergency generators to provide backup power to the facility. Some facilities are also using them in a non emergency demand response or prime power capacity if the engines meet the applicable emissions requirements. These engines are typically either diesel fired and subject to NSPS Quad I or natural gas fired and subject to NSPS Quad J. Some data centers are exploring the installation of natural gas fired combustion turbines to provide on site power generation in order to supplement or bridge power from the grid. Non emergency generators and fuel cells are also considered for this on site generation, and they would require air permits as well. If emissions controls are required for your site, those would also need to be in the air permit to take credit for emissions reductions. And those are the primary emission sources at data centers, but other equipment like storage tanks and evaporative cooling equipment could also be included in a data center's air permit. So now that we know what is being permitted at data centers, what are some of the early permitting considerations to keep in mind? Many factors can affect air permitting, but considering air permitting early in the planning process can affect aspects of the project. The size of the data center will have a major impact on air permitting, as that is as that typically directly correlates to the number of emergency generators required. Whether the data center is located in an area designated as in attainment or non attainment with the NACS impacts the major source thresholds, which in turn impacts the evaluation of the operating limits and or emissions controls required to be a synthetic minor source. Additionally, the ownership of the data center or campus should be considered when evaluating air permitting. If all of the campus buildings have common ownership, or if a new facility is being constructed adjacent to another facility under the same ownership, agencies will usually aggregate those sources for purposes of comparison to the major source thresholds. However, if buildings have different majority owners, then the state air permitting agency might allow them to be considered separate sources, each with their own major source threshold, rather than being aggregated as one source. Common operatorship, even with differing common ownership, may also lend buildings to being aggregated by the state, and the Virginia guidance document APG 204 provides great information on this. The construction schedule or phasing of a facility is not always known upfront, but considering the general timeline is helpful as that can affect how some states consider the permitting. From the perspective of defining a project when evaluating applicability of those federal construction permitting programs, timeline between builds is one of the criteria to consider. From the perspective of how much of the facility to include in the initial air permit, some agencies may want to see the entire facility to be permitted upfront, whereas others are comfortable with it being permitted in phases as long as the full build has been evaluated too. An additional factor to consider early in the permitting process is the number of generators needed and the operating mode. As mentioned with the planned size of the data center, the number of generators and how they will be operated will be a key factor that affects air permitting. Will the generators only be used as emergency units, or will they be used for non emergency purposes too? And if so, what type? That not only affects the permitting, but may also dictate what engines should be purchased. Recently, emergency demand response and other similar programs have become a hot button topic, which revolve around an agreement between a data center and the utility provider, where the data center runs its generators in times of high demand or stress on the grid to allow the utility to prevent brownouts. When approached about such programs, it is critical to understand the components, who is initiating and in what circumstances. Then check those against your air permit and the federal rule. The federal rules currently prohibit non-emergency operations for financial arrangement by emergency engines unless their five specific criteria are met. This means that for engines from 2011 or later, currently Tier 4 certified would be required to operate outside of those five criteria. Aaron Sabot from EPA's Office of Air announced at a conference at the end of March that they plan to revise the regulations in the summer to allow operation of Tier 4 compliant engines for demand response operation, but nothing has been published yet. States can implement a stricter interpretation, therefore, please check this carefully before enrolling in grid response programs so as not to inadvertently create a non compliant situation for your air permit. On another note, customer operating requirements, such as minimum number of hours of testing per year, will influence air permitting and should be considered. The same for emissions controls. Understanding whether they will be required based on the state's backed, the customer's preferences, and or to help avoid major source thresholds impacts not only air permitting, but also capital costs for the projects. Additionally, if on-site power generation is being considered due to limits or delays in availability of utility as part of the air permitting evaluation, consider if the on-site generation facility shares common ownership with the data center or if they'll have a separate owner. The topic of ownership or operatorship, along with the additional emission sources that will be located at the facility, could add some permitting complications. Consider if the permitting program requires air dispersion modeling as early as possible. Not only can it result in a potentially longer review time prior to permit issuance, but the results could impact emissions controls, stack heights, and other parameters that are handy to know in the design phase. Lastly, the location of the facility beyond the attainment status of that area should be considered. If it is located in an environmental justice area or an area that is not receptive to data centers, that can impact the air permitting requirements and affect the timeline of the project. Air permitting strategy ultimately culminates in three main considerations. The first consideration is the regulatory burden. What type of air permitting program is the facility willing to accept? Beyond the initial air permitting, which for federal construction programs adds time, cost, and risk to the process, being a major source or minor source can affect the ongoing compliance burden of the facility in terms of record keeping or reporting requirements in the permit and can impact the complexity of permitting future expansions. The second consideration is operational flexibility. The total hours of operation or fuel consumption required by the data center to meet its testing requirements, and in most states, also accommodates some amount of unexpected or emergency operation. The last consideration is capital cost. For data centers, this usually equates to the installation of emissions controls, which could be costly. The share here is that during an air permit strategy, as early in the process as possible, the best combination of these three levers should be evaluated. Perhaps the path is to accept stricter limits and install controls to avoid major source, or perhaps the facility is willing to accept a Title V operating permit in an attainment area, but avoid PSD, so they only need to install NOx controls on half of their generators. For larger facilities, some compromise on these items is expected to meet customer needs, be mindful of cost, and also stay on schedule. The last thing I have before I turn it over to Sharon for Virginia specifics is the challenges associated with air permitting. The regulatory landscape is always evolving, whether that is the attainment status of an area, a changing BACT, or other requirement that can affect the need for emissions controls, or proposed or new state specific requirements for data centers. Many states are trying to address the data center influx and are considering how to best regulate them, which could lead to changes in requirements in the future. Virginia is very familiar with data centers, but they're still improving their air permitting regulations in real time, as Sharon will speak to in a moment. Another challenge is the receptiveness of the community, as public engagement can slow down the permitting process in locations where there is concern or opposition to data centers. Data centers are also expanding into states with limited experience in the industry, which is a learning process for those state agencies and may result in an iterative permitting process while they establish their process and guidance. Finally, the power needs of data centers, both in on site density and utility availability, will be an ongoing issue for the industry and one that will impact air permitting as prime power equipment is installed, innovative technologies get proposed, and facilities increase in size. So I will now turn it over to Sharon to discuss nuances of Virginia air permitting.
Great. Thank you, Harry. Appreciate that. Just going to apologize in advance for the voice, good old spring cold and allergies. So just bear with me if I also have to go on mute for just a moment to cough or take a sip. Anyway, so glad y'all are here today. Harry, thank you for that. Getting us started to talk about data center air permitting kind of generally. And I appreciate how you, sprinkled in some Virginia tips along the way. So this half of the webinar is going to talk about Virginia air permitting specifically. I'm going to talk about 5 things to know And so first up is probably the biggest news for Virginia data center air permitting, and that is the new legislation and guidance around Tier 4 equivalent generators, even for emergency purposes. And so if you haven't heard of this requirement, here's what it says, that for an air permit applications submitted on or after July 1st, 2026, data centers need to put forward Tier 4 equivalent engines. So for most engines, this is going to require a selective catalytic reduction, a CR unit for NOx reduction, potentially a diesel particulate filter for PM or particulate matter control, and then potentially an oxidation catalyst for carbon monoxide control. This is different from what Virginia has historically required for emergency generators. They were their hourly number, they were requiring was 6 grams per bike horsepower hour, and that's what most folks have been working towards. But this is going to be a shift, and if you're sitting there thinking, well, I already have a permit, I already have generators that are permitted or installed, what happens? Well, we're going to talk a little bit about more of that on the next slide, but the answer is you don't have to automatically retrofit your equipment. Only retrofits would come into play potentially if you were modifying, that existing equipment or that permanent equipment. So don't fear if nothing's changing with your equipment. You shouldn't have to do anything. But we will note that Virginia DEQ is still working through how they're going to implement this process. It's definitely a new thing for Virginia to shift through. Illinois, as we know, just went through this. They signed legislation in January, and their date for very similar requirement is December 1st, for example. So another question folks have been asking is, we have guidance, the APG 576 from Virginia DEQ. It was launched in December. There was public comment period in the spring, but then there was also the House Bill 507 that was signed by the governor, and they differ a little bit. The legislation is just require Tier 4. The guidance had a lot more nuance. It talked through some different ideas. And so one of the questions we've had for Virginia DEQ is what happens when they differ? And the answer is the legislation wins. So in these next couple bullets, we're going to highlight where that maybe helps folks and maybe it isn't maybe as flexible as it could have been. So diving in on the Tier 4 equivalent engines. So when we think about NOx, which is our primary pollutant of concern, in Virginia, those emergency generators in those July 1st permit applications and later are going to need to meet 0.6 grams per horsepower hour. That's the current non-emergency presumptive BACT is what they call it, the current non-emergency short-term limit in Virginia. And the expectation is that you're still going to have to do that stack testing that I know we're all used to, 90+% engine load. And so that number is going to be in play with your permit applications. Now, a question that people came up with, and you heard when I went through the control devices, I said, may need an oxidation catalyst, may need a diesel particulate filter. And the reason why is that even though the guidance read as though you had to have the control technology, because the legislation just says Tier 4 equivalent, the need to have controls is only if you actually need them. So, for example, carbon monoxide is a pollutant where even if we're looking at that emissions data from the vendor, that not to exceed potential site variation, that worst case data, if those numbers are less than the Tier 4 standard and you can comply without an oxidation catalyst, then you don't need to put one on. So that was great clarification that we got from Virginia DEQ in a call last week. Now, something that we also learned in that conversation, and we know that Virginia DEQ is working on some guidance, is taking again those worst case emissions factors that we're used to using in our permitting for our generators. And at first we were thinking you just compare to the Tier 4 standard, which we know is a weighted average over multiple engine loads. And so to try to help account for the fact that Tier 4 standards are a weighted average, what you're actually going to do in your permit application, if you're trying to assert that you can comply with the Tier 4 standards, is you're actually going to compare your engine data to the Tier 4 standard with a 1.25 scaling factor to the Tier 4 standard. And so the goal with Virginia DEQ there is that your worst case emission factors will result in a pound per hour in your permit that you can comply with during your stack testing. But then it's more of an apples to apples comparison by looking at that emissions data compared to the Tier 4 standard with a multiplier. And so wanted to kind of get that out there if it's something that people are starting to work on their permit applications for submittal after July 1st. We know there are a lot of you working on them for July 1st, but that way you have that in mind. And again, DEQ is going to come out with some guidance and some FAQs around all of this. Another thing where maybe the legislation is less flexible than the guidance might have been is in that idea of the administrative or house generators or those redundant generators. In the guidance document from DEQ, it talked about how, maybe those don't need to be Tier 4 equivalent. Maybe there can be some flexibility there. But the legislation doesn't provide that. It just says, engine generator sets need to be Tier 4 equivalent. So even if that's that 500 kW house gen or something, it will need to meet the Tier 4 equivalent standards starting July 1st and forward. But to note, because it does say generator sets specifically, fire pumps, water pumps that are diesel fired do not have to be the Tier 4 standard. They are, they're not generator sets, so therefore this new legislation does not apply to them. So there are definitely some open questions with Virginia DEQ. We know that they are working on them closely with the central office, the different regions. There's a work group. So we're going to continue to get the latest and greatest as we go through. But also some of this stuff will just kind of get worked out after July 1st, which we can appreciate some uncertainty around this as folks are trying to decide whether or not to pursue a permanent action ahead of July 1st or after. Our commitment to you all is that we're going to keep you informed as we learn more. We are going to do a blog, but we'll also just make sure maybe even to this attendee list, we'll make sure we get updates. So again, DEQ is working on some guidance. So a couple of things that we have a good interpretation around, but they're still finalizing. So one question might be, I want to submit my permit application before July 1 so that I don't have to be Tier 4 equivalent. What needs to be part of it to be considered complete? And so the answer is everything you could possibly have accurate and thorough to start, please do. That includes the fee. That includes the final count of your generators, the type that you're going to put in, the size, that it needs to be as technically and administratively complete as possible for July 1. Another item, it sounds like the prevailing opinion is that even those local governing body forms, the site suitability form, that they also need to be approved by the locality by July 1 so that it can be considered technically complete. So that might be a bit of a lost leader here if you've not already started that process and you're trying to submit by July 1. I'd recommend diving in on that first. So another question is, folks might be used to, DEQ is reviewing their permit application, and they've been really flexible to be able to, maybe do an amendment and swap out a generator for a different type of generator. Maybe supply chain has made it so that you need to switch manufacturers or something. That flexibility is likely going to go away. Virginia DEQ has received some guidance that they're really not going to be allowed to process applications until they have been deemed complete. So the ability to make kind of these mid-review changes will be much reduced. And so the guidance here is don't count on that for your permit application. Try to be as complete and thorough as possible. Maybe that even means putting in, 2 or 3 options in your permit application and building that into the permit. Another big question that folks are asking, and this is very much still undergoing discussion with Virginia DEQ, is what happens if you are modifying a permit that has generators in it that were permitted, before the July 1 application deadline. And so this can take a couple different forms. What happens if you are doing something to change the generators themselves? Now, I'm not talking about, putting in something new. We that can appreciate that would probably need to be a new permit and require whatever the latest BACT is, that Tier 4 equivalent. But what if you are changing from an hours based limit to a fuel based limit? There's probably a good chance that if it's permitted and installed, DEQ won't reassess BACT. But maybe if you are increasing the operating limit, you need more fuel or more hours, that could be something where DEQ does need to take a look. And whether they're going to treat permitted and installed generators differently from permitted and not yet installed generators is something that's still ongoing, in ongoing discussion. And then another question is, what happens if you're not changing the equipment that's already in that permit, but you're adding new equipment or adding another building? This is also something that DEQ is discussing further. Still a lot of discussion around that. And so we will continue to get the latest and greatest to you as we get it. But I guess the key takeaway is go ahead and if you're trying to do the July 1 timeline, make it as complete as possible, maybe even including building in some options. And if you're looking to increase throughput through some of your equipment that's already in a permit, if the timeline works to be able to do the July 1, maybe go ahead and think about pulling that forward. Just as a caution, those air permits do expire if there is a gap in construction of 18 months. So just make sure that you are planning your project carefully and that your permit doesn't just expire before anything happens and you end up having to go tier 4. So that's the biggest, hot topic. I know we spend the longest on that, but we know it's top of mind. And again, we'll get out updates as we get them. But we've got lots of other things to chat about in Virginia. So another one is that, if you're used to permitting in other states, Virginia has a little bit different definition of their emergency generators and what's allowed and what's not allowed. Certainly if there is a power outage, the primary power is disrupted, you don't know about it, it happens, then of course you can use your generators. Something that is unique with Virginia is that they don't adopt the federal rule of the 50 hours of non-emergency. That's not a default allowance in Virginia. So, if you're sitting there thinking, well, the utility's got to cut my power because they need to do, some work, on the electrical system, or they need to run cabling to the neighboring data center. So Virginia DEQ has heard you on that. The prevailing opinion has been, maybe having to get rental units, or if it's a short outage, can it be paired with maintenance or training or something that is allowed by your permit? But it was happening a lot that folks have an unforeseeable grid outage. And so Virginia DEQ has issued a guidance document for 2025 of September that if it's an unforeseeable grid outage and you had less than 14 days notice, then you can use your permitted equipment. You do have to, watch out for ozone season. You need to watch out for your record keeping and your throughput, your operating limits. Make sure everything is good there. But that did provide a little bit of flexibility. Their understanding and their thought is that if you have more than 2 weeks notice, then you can arrange for rentals or some other way. Virginia, Harry talked a little bit about emergency demand response. That is, very limited by the federal rule. It's also very limited by most states, including Virginia. But there is an emergency load response program that Virginia may allow for your emergency generators to participate in. But you need to have conversations with them and make sure that program meets their criteria exactly, along with also making sure it complies with the federal rule. If we have permits, as recent as 4 or 5 years, we also are familiar with the maintenance checks and readiness testing operating limit that's in the permit. It's kind of a sub-limit to the overall operating limit that probably keeps your emissions less than those major source thresholds, which is what Harry was talking about earlier. And this is for your planned maintenance operation. And then, Virginia allows, your other sort of testing that you might need to do, in unscheduled maintenance, you're making sure that the engines are in good working order. And then a lot of you probably also have permits with the ozone season. There's a lot to say here, but just please be really mindful of that. There are only certain circumstances where the engines can operate by monitoring the air quality index and such. Outside of that, they need a waiver from the Virginia DEQ. So please double check that if you need to run during the ozone season, and just make sure you're not inadvertently getting out of compliance. And then lastly here, just a reminder that in Virginia, the expectation is that your operating limits captures all generator operation, both planned and unplanned. We know that can be different from maybe some other states. When we think about Virginia and non-attainment areas, so you heard from Harry that Virginia is moderate non-attainment for ozone. In the Northern Virginia area, you'll see the counties and cities there. And so that translates into a 100 ton per year threshold for NOx and VOC just on its own. But we have an additional kind of layer here in Northern Virginia because we're part of the ozone transport region. I say we because I currently live in Loudoun County, sitting here in Fairfax County as we give you this presentation. And the ozone transport region actually reduces the VOC major source threshold for us here to 50 tons per year. So when Harry was talking about whether or not you might trigger trigger major source, some sort of major source news source review program, then 100 tons of NOx and 50 tons of VOC is what does that here in the Northern Virginia area. And then once you get into the counties south of here, south into the west, then 100 tons would trigger Title V, but then that 250 or some of those other thresholds that Harry mentioned would be what kicks in. All right, so then a little bit about our air permitting. And so you all are going to get these slides. I'm not going to necessarily read through all of the pieces, but got some different types of air permits in Virginia. There's a general permit for emergency generators. It's not usually very helpful for a data center, just given the quantity. And then you heard Harry talk about the minor NSR permit, the minor news source review permit. And you could have a couple different types of facilities in this bucket. You could not need operating limits to stay below the major source threshold. This might be very doable if you have an edge data center that has 4, 6, 7 generators, 500 hours. You might be below that 100 ton threshold, for example. But most data centers, we have to take an operating limit on hours or fuel in order to get our potential emissions down below those major source thresholds. And so they get the same minor NSR permit. It just has operating limits in it. And then, that's where most data centers are. They're in that minor NSR permit, but we are starting to see, particularly as they have, large campuses or start to consider on-site generation, we're starting to see them edge over that 100-ton threshold into a major source. And so we've got some different types of major source permits in Virginia, one of which is called a state major, which means that your facility-wide potential emissions are greater than those Title V thresholds. So greater than 100 tons of NOx, for example, but you don't trigger the federal construction permit thresholds, so the PSD or the non-attainment news source review. I think a key item to highlight here, because we are starting to see data centers consider this in the southern part of Virginia, that because the permit as a state major has to go for public comment, because of that, Virginia DEQ requires air quality modeling as part of the permit application. And so that's important. You heard Harry talk about needing to plan for that ahead of time as much as possible. And so I want to just make that distinction for you all. And expect that permit process would be a little bit longer, both the preparation of the application because of the modeling, but then also the public notice period. And then there's a higher fee. And then if you need to trigger one of the two federal construction permitting programs, the PSD or the non-attainment news source review, you can see here that, one for attainment, one for the non-attainment area. That can have a variety of things. If you're the PSD permit, you need to do modeling. There's a public comment period. For non-attainment news source review, you have to do an automatic kind of worst case emissions control installation as the lowest achievable emission rate. The biggest potential hurdle with the non-attainment news source review is emissions offsets. That here in Northern Virginia, there aren't many of those, and so that could add risk to your project. And then that last bullet builds off of what Harry shared around Title V, that if you have any of these types of construction permits, you'd also have a Title V operating permit. And then a few miscellaneous notes about Virginia. So you heard me talk earlier about the complete application, that if you are a greenfield site, Virginia requires the permit application process to also have a local component to it. So that local authority, the county or city, they need to look at the local governing body form and the site suitability form and approve those. Another question comes up around source aggregation. So Virginia in January 2025 published some guidance about permitting generators, about permitting data centers. We have a link to that on our next slide, so you can take a look. It also talks about that they consider needing an air permit when you pour the generator pad, for example, if your generators are going outside the building on pad. So it's a helpful guidance document to look through. I would just note that anything that in there talks about tier 2 versus tier 4 emission standards, certainly the most recent guidance and the legislation will, supersede that. But under the source aggregation, we get asked this question a lot. You heard Harry talk about maybe you have a couple of different buildings, couple different campuses that are, aggregated right next to each other, adjacent. Maybe they have common ownership. There's also a distance component to this, and you'll see that first bullet. Virginia's guidance kind of, lays out some different distances. If you're less than 1/8 of a mile, common owner, common function that, DEQ will likely aggregate your buildings. If you're between a quarter and an eighth and a quarter of a mile, it might be more case by case. If you're more than a quarter mile apart, then Virginia might consider each of them a single source. We'll note that this is just a guidance document. This is not firm, so definitely make sure you have a conversation with DEQ, but it does show how the distance component can play a role. And then, you heard Harry talk a bit about the common operatorship is is an important thing for Virginia DEQ. They have a guidance document about that. So just as you look at your projects to see what might need to be aggregated, definitely recommend a conversation with them to talk that through. Just because there's a different owner, different LLC, something like that, that doesn't necessarily mean that you will be able to separate those buildings or those campuses. And then the last item here is around power generation. We certainly know that's a hot topic with co-locating or bringing power in close proximity to a data center to support, as Harry said, with bridging power. So you know the states, a lot of states are kind of wrestling with this because technically they will often have different owners. Certainly if the data center owns the power, that makes you're kind of aggregated. That's a little bit of a given, but maybe you have a different owner of the power, different owner for the data center. And so there have been in cases where states have allowed those to be separate, different owners, so they're different entities. There's still some states that are very friendly to that. Virginia has agreed to separation before, but it sounds like they might be rethinking it. And so we'd err on the side of power and data center will likely be aggregated, even if they are different entities. Again, talk with the agency, but that does seem to be kind of the way that they're headed. As we continue our miscellaneous, permitting notes here, non-road engines is another thing we hear a lot about. So, the latest guidance from DEQ is that as long as the engine it meets the definition of non-road, so we're portable in nature and we're on site less than 12 months, it does not need an air permit because it is not a stationary source, and that interpretation is regardless of whether that engine is providing prime power or backup power, and regardless of the quantity. And because it doesn't need an air permit, a lot of times we get a question about ozone season. So technically the ozone season, restrictions don't apply because there's no air permit. Now, certainly when Virginia DEQ weighs in on this, they will also say there could be a public opinion, public perception piece to this. So try to be mindful around your operation. If you do deploy non-road engines, but technically you would be safe with Virginia DEQ. Always though, feel free to always, connect with them though, just to give them a heads up that that's what you're doing. Environmental justice. So Virginia, up until just recently, had very little to say about environmental justice when it comes to air permitting, because the permit guidance has been in draft for a couple of years now, no change. However, with House Bill 1266, that has shifted, and now the requirement is for Virginia DEQ to issue environmental justice permitting guidance by the end of this year. And so the legislation talks about evaluating cumulative impact. So that's something that DEQ is working on now, how to assess that. And then they're going to go through several steps. There's an informal public comment period in this summer, and then they'll have kind of an official public comment period in the fall to help meet that timeline. And then there was another House bill with a companion Senate bill that also kind of dove into the EJ topic, and it was requiring localities of a certain size to also develop their own comprehensive plan and EJ strategy. So this will be something interesting to watch, because what we could have happen is, there might be state permitting guidance, but then there could be different local requirements when it comes to environmental justice. And so it'll be really important as folks evaluate, location by location and with their permitting strategy, just to make sure that they have the latest and greatest site-specific information possible. And then these last two bullets here are just highlighting some of the Virginia DEQ resources available to data centers. So with the recent permit transparency and the PEEP, that Virginia DEQ has launched, some years ago, there's the ability to look at your permits and your permit application and track progress. So you'll see there the link to that. And then I mentioned that, Virginia DEQ has put out those guidance documents in 2025, and they've added a few more documents to that website, along with all of the air permits for data centers issued by the state. And so you'll see the link there as well. So just wanted you to know that those resources were available. So you heard me talk about setting. So anyway, lots of great stuff happening in Virginia. A lot of interesting stuff. Certainly, Virginia DEQ is really amenable to discussing these items with you. That's my second bullet here. They're very responsive to questions, and we definitely recommend. You heard me talk about connecting with DEQ. Connect with them to talk about definition of a project. Connect with them to talk about ownership and operatorship and source aggregation. Connect with them if you're thinking about bringing non-road engines on site, or you need a case-by-case determination on your BACT for post July 1, or or if you need to run your generator during the ozone season and give it some justification. So a lot of different opportunities to connect with the agency. Email, phone, it all works well. Really, definitely recommend that team. They're super helpful in Virginia. We're very lucky to have that team. If you have done permitting in Virginia, there's initial letter of determination that's issued within 30 days of the air permit application being submitted. And that's where they ask questions and such. I highlight this here. It's a component of the permitting process, but if you're thinking about getting a permit application in by July 1, I would recommend looking at previous 30-day letters, what we used to call them ILODs, and just see what had been asked for before and go ahead and proactively include that in your permit application. So for example, go ahead and send your Excel file of your permit application calculations when you email your permit application. Go ahead and speak to the maintenance checks and readiness testing limits that you want in your permit. Put those in your cover letter or your narrative. Go ahead and tell them what the belly tank capacity would be. So those are some pro tips. Go ahead and address some of those things that they would ordinarily ask for, just so that your permit application is complete as possible. Processing timelines, these are just kind of in our experience and what we've seen on their website to plan for. Plan for 4 to 6 months if we're just looking for kind of your regular old air permit, minor NSR. But plan more for the 6 month. What we're not sure is what the backlog is going to look like with the July 1. So these numbers could potentially extend depending upon how many permit applications Virginia DEQ gets for July 1. So just be mindful of that, maybe allow a little bit more time. And then we do know that some states have an expedited permit option, but Virginia is not one of them. On the fees, again, we can always take a look at these. This is just kind of show the different types of fees and different quantities. I think two things to take away here. One is that these fees escalate with the consumer price index each year, and that particularly for large projects, it's actually very handy that the permit fee is for the permit application, for the permit action itself, not per piece of equipment. So that can certainly save a lot on that cost. And then our last slide here before we open it up for questions, we've submitted our permit application. So now what? So, Virginia will probably still have questions. They're going to, issue that ILOD. They might have other follow-up questions by phone or email. Always ask for a copy of the draft permit so that you can review it, ask questions, provide comments. You get that final permit. Of course, you absorb and train on it, make sure everyone's good to go. Preparing your record keeping templates, tracking tools, logs, however it is that you're going to keep track of your operating and emissions information. In Virginia, you're most likely going to have to stack test. 20% of your engines is kind of the prevailing number, often in companion with visible emissions. There's usually some sort of annual air report that Virginia requires. And then not just air, right? You have a whole lot of storage tanks that usually come with our diesel generators. Just a note though, that in Virginia, currently belly tanks or sub-base tanks aren't actually required to be registered under the oil program, but they certainly need an SPCC plan. So just, that 13-20 gallons of above ground storage goes pretty quickly with, a portion of one belly tank for a big generator. So you're usually going to need an SPCC plan, but you don't normally need, a state registration of any kind. And usually storage tanks are exempt from air permitting. And then also there's hazardous materials, your batteries, your fuel, your refrigerants, et cetera. So don't forget your EPCRA notifications and Tier 2 report. And that is all for me. We still have some time for questions, so I'm going to invite the team back and see what we have.
Great. Thank you, Sharon and Harry, for walking through all of that. We do have a few questions, and I am going to go to Harry for the first one, which is this new requirement for Tier 4 equivalent engines only applicable to data center projects or all industries?
Yeah, thanks, Sahil. No, that's a great question. I saw that one come through. This is only for the data
Harry,
center.
could you pull your thing down? I'm sorry, pull your microphone down. Can't hear you, dear.
You couldn't hear me the whole time. That's rough. This is a great question. I saw this one come through. This requirement is only for the data center industry. So if you're a hospital or something else, it would not be applicable to you.
Great, thank you, Harry. Sharon, I'll go to you for this next one. The question is, what emissions are related to cooling towers?
Yeah, great question. So particulate matter is usually what we are looking at. Particulate matter can actually be higher than you think it might be. If you aren't familiar with how to quantify emissions from cooling towers, there's a section in EPA's AP42 emissions guidance that talks about it. The flow rates, the drift factor, if it's natural or induced draft. So there are several aspects of the cooling tower that can influence emissions, but I'd refer you to that chapter. I don't recall it offhand, but PM emissions is the short answer, and definitely take a look at that AP42 guidance document for more information on how to calculate them.
Great. I'm going to stick with you, Sharon, on a question about linear generators. The question is, if I used a linear generator, for example, a Hylian Carnot unit, can I avoid air permitting? That's the short version of the question.
Okay, appreciate that. I don't have much experience with linear generators, but I don't know if Virginia DEQ has permitted them. I don't recall offhand, but I know that they have been permitted for data centers in other parts of the country. This came up while doing some research for another project. Those were in an air permit. So I can't say that you could get away without a permit, but what I would recommend is, taking a look at whatever emissions documents or whatever EPA might have published about them, um, compare those to the exemption thresholds for permitting in Virginia's rules. So 9VAC 51105C should be your emissions thresholds. And if you're below those, then you would technically be exempt from air permitting. So I would take a look there, start there, and then have a conversation with Virginia DEQ just to get some concurrence on your exemption assertion. So I wouldn't default right to don't need a permit, but if they're very low or no emissions, then going through that exercise could just help provide documentation to the facility that the process has been followed.
Great. Next one, I'll go to you, Harry. So earlier in our presentation, we stated that the permit must include all operation, hours or fuel use for both planned and unplanned usage. By unplanned, do we mean unplanned maintenance, or are unplanned emergencies also included in PTE?
Yeah, this is a great question because it does kind of vary state by state. So it's good to know what your state specifically is looking for. In Virginia, this means any limits you're taking on operation should include all operation, planned, unplanned. So that's your regular maintenance readiness testing. That's any an annual blackout test you might do, unforeseen maintenance that you might do if your engine breaks down, sometime getting it back up and running, also emergency usage as well. So how much fuel or hours you would need for an actual emergency.
Yeah, thank you, Harry.
And
Sharon, I'm going to,
no,
oh,
go
if
ahead.
you had, we're going to move on to a question around power generation and aggregating data center with the power generation facility. The question is that due to sharing equipment?
Um, well, if they are, we'll back up. So if the owner of the power generation equipment and the data center are the same and they're near each other, adjacent, then we're often aggregating those together kind of by default, even though they might technically have different SIC codes, power versus data center. But if they're owned and adjacent, that usually pulls them together. If they're owned by different people and operated by different people, but still adjacent, this is where it becomes a little bit more of a gray area. Um, the shared equipment certainly helps tie them. So if you're trying to justify separate owner, separate operator, different SIC code, because one is data center and one is power, even though they're adjacent, you need to find as many other severs in the relationship as possible. So for example, other than, can appreciate there would have to be a tie from the power, over to the data center, of course. But, the data center should not control the fuel for the power generation. Like there need to be as many separations as possible to bolster the justification for separate owner and operator. Um, but and another thing that has often been discussed in this is if the power is primarily supporting the data center, then there's a lot of conversation around a support facility, that the power is supporting the data center as but the majority of its output that often tends to aggregate. So all that being said, Virginia has in the past been has allowed a separate owner, separate operator, power, and data center to be separate, each with their own major source thresholds. However, they are revisiting that decision, and based on some information that we've heard recently, it looks like they are pivoting back to, or maybe not back, but pivoting to bringing those, aggregating those two together and having to share a major source threshold. So I'm not entirely sure about the shared equipment, but certainly any sort of severs in between the relationship as possible to bolster a separate source justification would be needed to make that justification stronger.
Great. We'll get to one or two more questions. There are several in the chat that will follow up with you all after this presentation, but maybe we can talk about permitting programs a little bit more. We got a question about whether or not there are any similar programs to Texas's permit by rule program in Virginia.
Yeah, the short answer is not really. There is a general permit for emergency generators, but there's a cap on the capacity that can be covered by that. Otherwise, there's nothing really that would apply to a data center. No, but I have made use of the Texas PBR program multiple times and love it. If I
Great.
can, I'll also just piggyback quickly on Harry's note about the emergency time as part of the limit. He's absolutely correct. The expectation is that you have planned for all operation. We'll say that, there's no guarantee, but if everyone is out for a major natural disaster for 2 weeks or something, there is an option to discuss with the agency, a flexibility enforcement or enforcement discretion if it results in you having an overage of your limits. That's not guaranteed. Certainly would have to be a case-by-case determination, but there is an avenue to bring that up with the agency, but the expectation is that you cover, all operation.
Great. I think we're going to call it there. We have some more questions in the chat that we'll certainly loop back with you all, but thank you so much for joining us today. And if you have any other further questions, please feel free to reach out to any of us. And just to let you all know, the recording will be on our website, and you'll receive those certificates shortly after this presentation is wrapped up. Thank you so much for joining us, and have a great rest of the day.
Great. Thank you all.